All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to welcome Rukia Monique Rogers in conversation with Dr. Ariana Brazier for a discussion of the many stories of our beloved community, honoring young children's kinship and connections with the world. We have been very hype about this book since we first saw it listed because we know Rukia's work at the Highlander School. Rukia is the founder of the Highlander School, an early childhood learning community in East Atlanta that honors children's relationships, their kinship with the earth, land, and community. And Rukia is a, a senior lecturer in early childhood education, um, as well as just a writer of all kinds. So we're very glad that she is here. She is joined by Ariana Brazier, PhD, who is a Black queer feminist and smiley, sad mom girl. She is a play-driven community organizer and educator who is motivated to raise a joyous, free Black child. She documents how Black child play functions as a grassroots method of community-based storytelling, teaching, and organizing. She is the CEO and president of the nonprofit ATL Parent Like a Boss, Inc., Parent Lab, whose mission is to enhance generational literacies through play in underserved African American communities. So we're really excited to have both of you here and to have an amazing discussion about this very important book, which is hot off the presses. Just came out on March 19th. And so we're really, really glad to learn more about how this can be a tool for people in our communities here in Atlanta and also around the country who may be watching with us tonight virtually. So if you are tuning in virtually and you want to ask a question, drop it in the chat and we'll vocalize it into the room. If you are here in person with us and want to ask a question when the time comes, just give me a second to bring the microphone to you so that everyone can hear you. But please put your hands together for Rukia Rogers and the many stories of our beloved community.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Rukia.
Hey, Ari.
We'll just jump in with my first question to you. So, in your introduction, you explained that the Highlander School draws on rich and vibrant culture of the Southeast and honors the Highlander Folk School of Tennessee, which was founded in 1932. Can you share more about the legacy of the Highlander Folk School and how that work shows up in the Highlander School here that we all love?
Sure. I also want to say it's an honor to be here with a parent, being in conversation with a parent from the Highlander School. And yeah, let's jump into it. About over a decade ago, when I was in the planning stages of opening the Highlander School, I was searching for a name that was the right fit. And so there was a lot of pressure to name the school an academy, a development center, something that would be quote unquote appealing to families. And so, in the midst of it, I was researching about Rosa Parks. She remains one of my many heroes, and discovered that 6 months before she refused to give up her seat, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott, she cited having been trained at the Highlander Folk School. And I was like, whoa, what is this? I'd never heard of it before, as part of my own learning and knowledge. And I just began this like rabbit hole of discovery of what was the Highlander Folk School. And being founded in 1932, again addressing worker rights in the Appalachian Mountains, but quickly shifting to addressing civil rights issues. It was a place where John Lewis, Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course Rosa Parks went for nonviolent resistance. And I was like, yes, this is it. I read the stories of how Eleanor Roosevelt like made her way through the mountains, being followed by J. Edgar Hoover. And I'm always like on the naughty side in life. So I was like, yes, this is my kind of place. And the name just resonated with my heart and soul. And I said, I knew in forming the school that I wanted to call on that legacy. And I wanted to be a place for children to be actively engaged in their own learning process, to be activists. And so landed on that name. And then it became kind of a thread of our work, our everyday lived lives of how do we amplify the voices of young children? How do we amplify the voices of our community to be engaged, to fight for injustices, to fight for, as the title, part of the title, but for the beloved community. And so there's that history, that legacy, and of course we know that the work of the Highlander, the original Highlander Folk School, continues on and really has just been a model for how we want to think about our lives with young children and our work with young children.
Thank you for that. I often like to think about Remix being at a preparatory academy for the Highlander Folk School. It's very cool when I'm like, oh, he goes to the Highlander, and they're like, the Highlander? And I'm like, yeah, the Highlander. Because they feel one and the same, especially when you get to be in the space and witnessing the work. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this book had me up early thinking very, very many thoughts. It had a hard time, if you saw my notes, I had a hard time narrowing down all my questions. Okay, so the next question for you is that at one point you cite William Schaeffer, who argues that children maintain a, quote, awareness of others' awareness. That is, the realization that we are not alone, exhilarated with the idea that we share awareness with others, and that others exist who are present to our experiences, end quote. Much of your book diverges from mainstream narratives about egocentrism being an innate part of child development. Who are the scholars and voices that have cultivated your understandings of child development, and how did you know to look for them and where?
Such a profound question, because I really struggled as an early childhood educator, because very often in my own schooling and my own coming to be an understanding, all of the theorists were predominantly white men. And it was through that lens that we were forming spaces in education, through the lens of white supremacy, and really through that particular lens. And so there was this wrestling, and being inspired also by educators from Reggio Emilia, the northern part of Italy, and their commitment to anti-fascist work, there was a shift in my own thinking and how I saw myself as an early childhood educator, that I didn't have to be dependent upon these theorists who didn't understand my own culture and the own context of which I was living, but reshifting my own image of young children, but also reshifting my own image of myself, that as a teacher, I was also a researcher, that in these daily lived experiences, we were connecting practice to theory and theory to practice. That every single day, this is the ways in which professional development unfolds, as one of my mentors, Shania at Shop Talk, reminds me. So it was through this own wrestling and research, I, along with my colleagues in a relationship with other early childhood educators, came to have new understandings, and also a reclaiming of my own, African, indigenous knowledge that had been lost, of what does it mean what does collective responsibility look like in a setting of early childhood education? What does it mean? What is the purpose of education? So a lot of that work, again, has been developed by observing young children, noticing young children, to develop new understandings, being inspired by the works of political activists, where you think of Bell Hooks or Gloria Buti or different folks. And I'm always so searching for that perspective from African and brown communities. For example, you would often be taught by early on, like, children should be on this kind of tight routine, right? Well, different communities have a different way of seeing time and experiencing time, or we would often be taught, well, children can't share, right? This is what we got from these white theorists. But in whose community can't share? And if we value the sharing of abundance, what does that mean? So instead of, why not offering things to children in such a way that they have to negotiate? So there's this dance of, again, observing children in relationship with other colleagues to have new understanding. So there's not this specific theorist or philosopher I can offer, but to say to early childhood educators to look within your own self and your own community and your own child's context, and knowing them will bring you closer to a deeper understanding of how to plan and be in relationship with your own community. That someone who's far overseas can tell you about their own context and their own experiences, but you every single day have that power to be able to research and have new understanding.
The part about the egocentrism like really stood out to me as someone who does and has studied child development. Like that does come up a lot, and in some instances, it's even been affirming to me because I'm like, oh, okay, it's just the developmental phase. But it reminds me actually of a quote from a film about the history of race, where one of the scholars says the questions you ask determine the answers you seek or the answers you'll find. And it sounds like some of our work has been like, well, why are these children so selfish? And we've been finding reasons to justify it instead of being like, actually, they're not. It's capitalism that has made us experience scarcity.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's about the questions and not so much the answers.
Right, exactly. Like the framework that we create, like school is a place for children to be trained to be workers in a capitalistic grind. If that's your framework, then what else comes after that? Versus we're offering a new way of thinking about a reimagined world. And then what is the purpose of school? What are these reconstructed frameworks for being in relationship with young children?
Yeah, I really appreciate that because, like, in the film, the question that they're referring to is like, why are Black people inferior? And then scientists went and found all of these reasons. And at the Highlander, the teachers are regularly asking these like bigger, more life affirming questions. And so they're getting life affirming answers and able to create a life affirming space and culture. So yeah, like reading your book it was so clear to me the divergence in like how we as everyday people in relationship with children could get there and ask different questions.
And that's different. And of ourselves too, because there's also this process of reclaiming for yourself. Because very often as a teacher, you've been taught to disconnect from your own culture. Like we've been colonized. So what does it mean when you're talking about children, like to tell a child to mind their own business, right? But if you come from a culture that values interdependence, where you've been taught to help other people, that your existence and is interconnected, then that's going to look very differently.
Yeah, we are each other's harvest.
Exactly.
Understood. So, in the section about diversity, actually getting to this conversation explicitly about race, you and the parents in the community, you named discomfort and shame as reasons we avoid difficult conversations with children. But you and I are almost always talking about fear. And so I wanted to make the space today to talk about how fear shows up in the Highlander community, whose fears are loudest, and what does it look like to confront those fears as legitimate fears.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question because we obviously know that fear is ever present, right? Like courage is not the absence of it, but I think in our dominant culture, there are certain subjects that are not off the table, and we really move in such a way that nothing for us is off the table as a community, and especially when it talks about justice and injustices and race and gender and so forth. And I think that's very often for adults, fear shows up in them just not feeling comfortable with discomfort. So children approach race in these heavy conversations with ease. But for adults, and it's interesting because I see a lot of families in the audience, and they remember some of the questions that we wrestled with as a community. And often, and at times for some of our white families, it was the need and desire to protect the innocence, which is particularly part of our culture, Southern white cultures. I want to protect the innocence of their child. Whereas in other, and not even maybe even a consideration. So if you're in a community where police interactions are naturally talked about, right? Because you're trying to prepare your child. You are mom of a Black child. And so you understand that maybe a little bit more. And in other spaces where you haven't had to be confronted with that, you haven't really thought about how do you talk to your child about a confrontation with police or so forth. And I think it just really pushes up against folks who often think of themselves as nice or good people, like they've signed up to be at the Highlander School. So I think for us, the beloved community is not just love and peace, right? It is that, but it is also the very presence of tension and the things that we have to wrestle with as a community. And we never turn away from the wrestling, that the conflicts actually create opportunities for deeper learning and deeper way of building communities and so forth. So I think those are the ways in which really fear has shown up. It's like, how do we find ways to move past um, those conversations? And they've shown up in letters, they've shown up in parent meetings, and we just hold space for the tension in a very grounded way.
Yeah, it makes me think of two related thoughts. The first one is ever since we started having this conversation about fear, I told you I start noticing when parents prevent their children from taking bigger risks on the playground. Mm-hmm. And I recently saw a mother tell her daughter, it was like one of those wooden bridges, and she's like, oh, you probably wouldn't like that. And so she turned her daughter in the other direction, and I called my mom, and I was so upset because I was like, this is how it starts. We start telling our children like that they shouldn't take big risks. We start telling our children they shouldn't follow the urges, their bodies. And for this to be a Black girl, I was really hurt too, because I'm like, this is how it starts for Black girl children, being told they shouldn't do things, they shouldn't dream big, they shouldn't take, big risks because there could be harm on the other side. And so I just feel like this conversation about fear and how it shows up even in these like seemingly minor interactions, like a playground experience between a parent and child, manifest in these other ways, like in school, in these letters and these lack of conversation.
And it's actually not minor, it's huge, because we've seen in the last decades children playing less and being in nature and connected to nature. And so this notion of what does it mean to be children who've had these less experiences, we've seen heightened sense of anxiety, we've seen more risk aversion and so forth. So you are priming folks, right, to be in spaces where their community is further apart, there's more screen time, there's less play, there's more of this anxiousness, right? And I believe that we need to return children to themselves and honor their connections with this earth and nature. It's vital.
Yeah, and I think too that how that little girl, for instance, would not have experienced the payoff of taking a big risk. And Brene Brown has this quote that I'm always citing, where in conversation with Ibram Kendi, she says, the greatest gift we can give a child is the ability to have difficult conversations. And she talks about how that only comes through practice, in conversation with children, conversation in front of children, conversation on behalf of children. And I think like those types of practices is where we learn the payoffs of risks, and we get to see like on a ordinary scale the payoff that maybe Rosa Parks or the Martin Luther Kings got to experience in being able to take these large risks. They were able to experience profound community.
Yeah. You're cultivating a culture around that. Dr. King was invited in to speak. This was the culture of Rosa Parks. And so when we're taking this away from children, and then 10, 20 years later from that, we're asking them to speak up about the injustices when we've stripped away their voices for many decades, then you can kind of see the result. It's really the courage is within us. And we're creating these structures, these systems that tell folks their voice doesn't matter, that tell them that taking the risk is too much. And it's crucial, especially in the world that we live in, that we create a space for children to their voices to be amplified and for them to be able to approach things with courage.
Yeah.
And knowing that their community is going to hold them.
I can't wait to go home and write about all this. Because I just think that, as a play scholar, we really aren't connecting what's happening in play on such a macro scale. Like that moment was maybe to that parent negligible. They'll never think about it again, but I'm still thinking about it a full month later about what that little girl might have walked away with, what remix, my own child might have walked away with, witnessing a parent tell this child, oh, maybe not today.
Yeah.
And so like play really does reveal the lack of conversations and the lack of risks in those, what we're obstructing our children from experiencing. Yeah. You also mentioned Reggio Emilia. So thinking about big risks, thinking about justice, we know that the Highlander is inspired by Reggio Emilia, which you write, quote, arose from the horrors and devastation of World War II and the survivors' commitment to developing an approach to education wherein dictatorship and fascism will never rise again. So we know that in creating this model, huge risks were taken as well. Well, my question to you is, what do you think the pedagogy will look like? What pedagogy will arise from the struggle to stop cop cities? What models are we going to be gifted?
Right. So that's a really profound question, because again, we're rethinking the framework and the purpose of school, and in the ways of being inspired by educators of Reggio Emilia, who again, their pedagogical approach was anti-fascist. And there was intricate parts of our daily works that are connected to that, believing that children have 100 languages, 100 ways of expressing themselves, and that society takes away 99. that children should come and be in a space where they have access to clay and paint and all these different means, including play, to express themselves. That should be their assumption. And that we're creating spaces where we value diverse perspectives and we value collaboration and their voices. I often tell the teachers, I love it when a toddler may push back. Like, I know it's challenging, but this is what we want. We want children, again, to be able, and I say children, humans, to be able to push back on what is perceived as authority. But really looking at our spaces, how are we as teachers holding power with children instead of over them? How are we moving their bodies? How are we honoring their agencies and so forth? I think in that pedagogy, for example, in terms of stopping cop cities, it's really a continuation of what we've always done. And I think this particular movement here in Atlanta to stop one of the buildings of the largest militarized police training facilities has been a shift of us as adults. You know, we kind of got very comfortable at having work around addressing those who are unhoused, addressing those who are experiencing food insecurities, but how are we really addressing members of our community who've experienced police brutality? How are we making shifts of how we're experiencing or talking about people who've experienced mass incarceration? You know, as a society, schools tends to hold police as community helpers. And how are we making shifts in that narrative that in a community, these are people, and we've criminalized poverty. We've criminalized people who made different choices, who may not have had the privilege. So I think it's extending the love and grace that we've held for many people in our community to all, because children will speak out about injustices and they will act if we're inviting them and making sure that they are part of the conversation. So I think this movement has been radicalizing for us as a school and for other early childhood educators, and that we're really realizing that we have a continuation of enslavement, that we routinely lock up more people than any other nation in this world. And if that is intolerable, and we are asking children to have language around what is fair and unfair, and we're asking children to act when they see injustices or discrimination, either alone or with courage, then that has to be extended to all members of our community. And it's a shift because a lot of us, in a subconscious or conscious way, bought into the narrative. They must have done something.
Yeah.
They must have done something. And they're behind walls, so you don't see it. But then you see the images of Tamir Rice. I can never not see the images of Tamir Rice, or you see the images in the story of Tyree Nichols. And you know there has to be a different way of living together in community. There has to be a different way, again, in which we're framing the purpose of school, not just for children to be workers, but that we are fighting for the beloved community, and that includes the liberation of all people. And how do we make sure that families and staff and children are part of the conversation? So the pedagogy to Stop Cop City is us making a shift in how we see all members of our community and standing up and fighting for liberation of all people within our communities. And children are a vital part of that and part of that conversation. And I think it's a beautiful process. Again, the beloved community, it's not without tension. Peace is love, and it's also incredibly hard. But I often tell folks, for me personally, just as much as I heard George Floyd calling for his mom, I feel compelled. I feel it's my obligation to resist and to make sure that that school is also a place of resistance. And even maybe I won't see the change that I want in my own lifetime, but I hope that when I see Remix marching in the school and chanting "Stop Cop City, Stop Cop City," that to me is a chant to stop Cop City and a liberation for all people, in the same way that they stop the bicycles when there is a worm going past, in the same way that they fight to save the ladybug, that their love and grace is being extended to everybody. And that for me, I feel like I'm kind of halfway done my job
Yeah.
to do that. And so I think that that's where the pedagogy to stop cop city begins. Abolition.
Absolutely. That's really beautiful. And if anybody here has spent space in the Highlander School, I think like just standing in the building, you get to experience that vision. It feels very real. It's like you're breathing in the air of that freedom and that vision, and you really cultivated it in every corner of that building. And it extends beyond the building. Every person I met that has been a part of your Highlander community, I feel gifts me a little bit of that breathing room that you're creating in your pedagogy, and that I see in this pedagogy that will come of the Stop Cop City struggle. I also think about how there is a growing movement to like abolish schools as we know them. Um, and even recently, I was talking with some siblings, and we were talking about how you need to listen to the children who are in these public schools, because these are children, these are people who are effectively in these carceral spaces and in these boxes that are also being built by the same people who are building prisons. And the visual that you just painted to me involves abolishing the structure itself, as much as the pedagogy, as much as the curriculum. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for the visual. As a visual thinker, you just made it very real for me. There's a moment in your book too that really like just it captured me for a minute, and if I could find it fast enough I would. But basically you're saying, y'all can see all my tabs, I'm not going to find it very quickly, but there's a moment in there where you're talking about how it's not just Black children who are grasping at language to describe themselves, and we're not having conversations like white children suffer too. And I just hadn't really thought about that. I know that racism hurts everybody, right? Like as a concept that kind of exists in a heady space, but to think that like, oh, there are white children who are looking for language and tools to describe their experiences, to name their skin color in relationship to their race, beyond white, beyond peach. I just had not taken a moment to think about. And so it was, your book really captures a both and.
And I was thinking, like, specifically, like, very often we just lump, okay, there's this whiteness, right? But very often there has been a disconnection between what have, indigenous Irish practices, disconnection from their connection to earth, right? So, what has colonialization done to all indigenous people? And so, in many ways, we've lost our way and we're returning because they don't quite have the language to describe race. But also, very often, we would ask families to describe it. How did your ancestors come here? What are your stories? It kind of got lumped into the melting pot of it all. And so, not knowing my ancestral practices, again, that connected me to earth pre capitalism, when land in abundance was shared. That has been taught and lost in many ways.
Yes, absolutely. It actually gets at my next question. You write that in order to heal from past atrocities, we must, quote, center the futurity, voices, and knowledge of African and Indigenous Americans, end quote. We so often hear about centering Indigenous histories. I wanted to know what it looks like to center African and Indigenous futurity, and if there are methods for centering this futurity beyond environmental sustainability, or if that has to be the core component, the environment.
Yeah, I no, it doesn't have to be the core. I think in this process of creating a framework of the school, there again, and I've said this a couple times in this conversation, a reclaiming of my own connectivity, my own connection to my ancestors, my own connections to African indigenous practices, and what does that mean, especially when you think of all of our theorists were white men. It was like navigating yourself, and no one was there to really guide and tell you. But there are different ways to be in community, again, where you value collective responsibility. Can we reimagine and reclaim different ways of economy? So, for example, we were very intentional to take out money out of the cash register. What are new concepts by which we share abundance, or ways communities might have barter, or how we decenter transactions and so forth? So for us, it's really a process of discovering by which we are learning with children. One of our classroom now has an apothecary because in this study of being connected to earth, the teachers, they were, Mexican educators were talking about how the ways in which this earth heals us. And a child had said, "Yes, I know because I take elderberry every single day. It's good for you. It's healing." She was 4, and I thought, I didn't know that at
Right.
I didn't know that. So then we were talking about the plants and how this is healing and lemon balm and chamomile. Who says there can't be an apothecary in a quote unquote room or classroom and so forth? So I think when we talk about the future, how does it mean to again reclaim skills and knowledge that were once lost? Because colonization was violent, and we talk about the violence that happened to the body, but also the violence that happened to the lost knowledge and wisdom of a people, that we had to create new frameworks by which we saw gender that in our dominant culture is more binary. What are other concepts of again living together, whether it's social studies or economy or all different ways of being in this world? And there hasn't been enough studying that. I mean, often we wrestle, for example, and we don't even wrestle with it, but in our infant classroom, like the dominant notion is like, okay, there has to be like the schedule with babies and so forth. And, some people like, oh, they should cry it out. Okay, well, let's study about that, right? In West Africa, those babies are held. In many indigenous tribes, those children are being carried by. So that informs us what communities have done in relationship to infants for centuries, the level of touch and being held that is needed. And the message again is it shows children this is the way I show up for you. When you're crying, even if you've been fed and have food, you need to be held and be touched. And those are the kinds of communities that we are seeking to create and to reclaim again wisdom, knowledge, and skills that are lost, whether it's knowing the connectivity by way of the apothecary or again just different ways of being community together.
That's really cool. I guess I had not really thought much about the Sankofa principle beyond history, like as a concept and like bringing that history forward. But it sounds like we bring that history forward so we can ensure that there's a forward to go to, that there's something, a life ahead of us. And it reminds me of when I first met this like community organizer in Pittsburgh, Michelle King. She introduced herself as Michelle King and a person on indigenous land whose mother had dreamed her into the future. And I just thought that was like so profound. And in the book, you also have like this quote about children being the result of like thousands of connections. And I just, I was almost overwhelmed to think like, yeah, like there are people who loved each other, who gave birth to people who loved each other, who gave birth to people who loved each other, and I'm the result of all of this love. And so much of the work in your book is almost a step by step of how to respond to children with the knowledge that they are the result of thousands of connections that are rooted in love.
Walking with 1,000 loves, right? Like this lie of individualism. We've never been alone. Even when we came forth from the womb, we were never alone. And those are part of, again, that celebration of life in that way. But then also for us to celebrate and give in this reclaiming of our members of our community who we say dearly departed, right? Or the kids say gone back to nature, those who are dead. So again, this is a way of reclaiming African indigenous values as part of our everyday lived experience, as part of the rituals. So celebrating the days of the dead, celebrating and making offerings to the trees and blessings. And our children are knowing this is what the honey's for and the sweetness of the bread, talking about the mother tree. It's interesting because it's ever present. It's always been present with children. I'm realizing that we are the ones that are teaching it out of them through this capitalistic grind. They notice the moon. They notice the phenomenons. They notice the rainbows. They notice all of that. We've got to be better at noticing it with them and honoring it, because in honoring them and their noticings, what we're really doing is honoring our ancestors and honoring our knowing and ways of being that have often been lost, because they are our greatest connection. And I say that in the book. I believe children are our greatest connection to our ancestors.
Yeah, and it's like when we're honoring their observation practices, we're honoring this. We're making space for our own future, our own sustainability. And I think in that myth of individualism, as you name throughout the book, we don't necessarily think of children as an integral part of our own sustenance beyond like, oh, that's my child, I need him. We don't actually think of them as like, no, we need them to be a part of this earth, to care for this earth because I need this earth. We don't necessarily think about the integrity of these connections beyond like, I'm the parent and you are my child, you are my reason.
We often treat children as property.
Yeah, and the abstract, which was one of my questions, is like, what does it look like to treat children in the abstract? You quote one of these scholars,
Lawrence Malaguzzi.
Malaguzzi, yeah, who says like we cannot think of children in the abstract. And so I'm not only curious what it looks like to center children in the abstract so that we can avoid it, but also like what does it look like to notice when that's happening in a place like the Highlander? Like, what does that abstraction look like?
I think as a society, we often see children and the abstract, we often see children as an empty vessel to be filled. And so we think about priming children for indoctrination. But I believe the reverse of that is seeing children again connected to their ancestors, connected to their community, their hopes and dreams, their culture, their racial identity, their ethnic identity, that they are connected to the history, the historical trauma. You know, we see, for example, the horrors of what we're witnessing, what's happening in Gaza, right? The violence that's happening in Gaza. That's not just happening to a society. The children are there most vulnerable, most impacted by what is happening, is integrated into their play and their ways of trying to make meaning of what is happening to them, just as is happening to the children in Congo. So we can never see children in an isolated way. They are an integral part of our communities. Right. They hold special thoughts. And again, this kind of new, I don't know, new age, just a child as an empty vessel to be poured information into, property. They're cute, they're adorable. A new wave is like to market things to parents that they're supposed to have, the new consumer and so forth. But again, they are rich, integral part, and it's important for teachers to take the time to know the story of that child before they come into your space. So for us, it's like home visits. It's different ways of knowing the child, knowing what are their family's hopes and dreams, what languages are spoken at home, how did their families come by way to this country, how did their parents meet each other. And the child will come in and they will have their own stories to share. And you, in your role as educators, is to listen, because each child brings with them 100 stories to tell and 100 more to tell.
It reminds me of this scholar, Soini Madison, I believe that's how you say their name. They use this term called co-performative witnessing in fieldwork. So they're talking about researchers who are in the day-to-day. As one parent that I was working with over in Thomasville used to say, in the trenches. You know, she used to be like, yeah, you were in the trenches with us. And I don't think we think of children as being in the trenches, but everything that we're experiencing as parents, chances are the children are also experiencing. They're witnessing the fallout of all of, they're experiencing it in a compounding effect, right? Because if I'm strapped for cash, they're witnessing this strap for cash lifestyle that I'm having to create, but also like they're experiencing my anxieties, my frustrations, my anger. They're literally in the trenches. And it sounds like in so much of your book, you are making space for educators to understand that we are all in the trenches together.
Right.
And the children are revealing to that to us. They're constantly telling us we just need to listen.
I would even say children notice even sometimes more than I think we do. We've learned to disconnect some way. If a member of our community who's unhoused, we kind of learn to drive past it. Children call us back and point it out, and they notice it. Like they're very much, and if you ever want to harm a group of people, you start with their children. You remove children to boarding schools. You take away things that are needed. This is how you harm the future of that culture and society. I mean, we talk a lot about liberation and abolition, and I think more conversations need to start with how are we creating space for young children, right? to thrive and be liberated, not be liberated, but to fight for liberation.
Yes. And I'm getting the almost everybody question time. So I'm gonna ask my last question, which is with a prefatory comment. I was high key very sad when I reached this moment in the book where you said, "Our story is far from over, but we've come to the end of this book." I There's just so much left to be said about the Highlander, and I don't know if like there were words to capture some of the experiences, but I do want to know what's next for the Highlander, what's next for you, and how people watching and beyond can support the forward momentum that the Highlander is creating for such a huge community.
Yeah. What's next? I mean, it's always a continuous learning process of us evolving. I think we're in a place of evolution. I think that the Stop Cop City movement has helped us in our place of evolution and called us to really be connected to our core values. I think we're in a process of doing more writings to put out, a manifesto in terms of what we believe is the purpose of education. Like we've had these internal conversations, but more of what we would like to express to our greater community and invite other early childhood educators, caregivers, folks in this with us to fight for the beloved community, wherever you are and however you can, because there still is injustice. As long as there are bombs falling in Gaza, as long as there's displacement in the Congo, as long as that there's displacement in Sudan, as long as we are incarcerating people in the United States on massive levels, and we see militarization being built up, that we know as communities we have much more work to do, and that we are here and we're calling people, inviting people in to be with us to fight for those beloved children in any way that they can. If you're a songwriter, write a song. If you make art. Do whatever way that you can to be in the struggle and to call people. And when I have meetings, as even for my own self, I very often ask and call on the courage of Harriet Tubman for us to keep moving forward until we are all free. So that's where we are at as a school, as an invitation for those to join us in this fight for the beloved community.
I'll also add, just before I pass it off, two other pieces that have often come up in conversation with you as contributions to this forward momentum is that you're building an archive of these conversations that the children are facilitating. You said the other day on a parent council call, we just need people to come in and take notes on what they see the kids doing, what they talk about, what they're interested in. And I thought that was so fascinating. As a researcher, there's a space for me at this school. I can literally come in and just watch the babies for an hour and be in awe. And then I get to put it on paper for someone else to be in awe. And it sounds like there's a space for archival work there. And then the other one is like passing on recipes. There's space to teach children play. Considering what you were just saying about more and more children being anxious and there being less and less play, I do think there's always space, especially at a place like the Highlander, for parents to come in and be like, I played this game as a kid. Let me teach you. And in it, you talk about hopscotch and how Miss Jessica played with a piece of glass, but the kids are playing with rocks. And so I think those are really important conversations. And I think we take them for granted as adults who weren't brought up during a quarantine era. And so I do think like those are other spaces for people who might be wondering what does it look like to plug in to any school space. It's those are two things that are very often taken for granted. Come in and play and come in and take note in a very literal sense.
So now we're going to invite folks to ask questions. If you're here in the room, again, please just raise your hands and I'll bring the mic to you. Okay. Hold on one sec. Come all the way around to the back.
I've never experienced that from a microphone. Sounded like we were about to take off.
Together. Okay.
That's right. It's like, as long as the whole building shoots off, we're
Hi.
cool. My kids in the back.
How are y'all? Good. My name is Jordan Freeman. I'm currently a sophomore at Morehouse studying early childhood education. Um, and recently I discovered this amazing artist and illustrator and educator who talks about children's books as like change agents and being able to really create social change. So my question is, how has like the Highlander School used literature and nature together to really kind of create a wonderful experience for the children?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, we're super selective about the books that come into the school. We have a social justice committee, and we spend a lot of time really going through our books. We discovered, like, people give you books, and we had to really take a second look and thinking in a deep way of what messages were coming through, but how are books reinforcing bias and that were problematic. And so we literally had times where we took out the books and kind of looked at all the messages for us to reorient ourselves, like how we were going to present them and read them with young children and so forth. So there's really been a concerted effort to not only bring in books that reflect our school, the identities of our founders and school, but also voices that are missing. So thinking about there, for example, are no folks in our building that identify as indigenous, but creating spaces by which there's stories that can be carried and there is a strong presence of those voices, whether they are indigenous or queer and so forth. So books are often the catalyst for helping the children to build empathy, to hear different perspectives, to wrestle with different things and so forth. And then there are certain books. I love the fact that so many books in our school have been banned and other spaces and so forth. And so that's just, but there are books that we've decided based upon their content that this is not a space for us because they don't meet with our core values. So I think, again, really thinking rigorously to my fellow early childhood educators about what decisions that you are bringing to reading the book first, thinking about, what messages are coming through, how can this be used with children, with that vocabulary words you want to use. Also, it's not a bad idea to point out the bias to the child. We had a one book about New York, for example, and there was no black and brown people in the book about New York. And so we decided to go ahead and share that and point that out to the children about what were their thoughts and thinking about it. But very often in spaces, we just kind of randomly like pick up books. But though being just very intentional about what you select to bring into your spaces is really important.
I'll add to there's a scholar, I only can remember their last name, which is like Hunleth. They did some work in Zambia where they took drawings that children had made about like sick relatives. And they were the scholars talking about how this is what they call imaginal care, that the act of imagining some sort of healing for the people they love is the care itself. And so the children would draw pictures of like them flying away with their family members, or they were superheroes and they had like the hospital on their shoulders. And that image itself was a form of care as present and real as like providing food. And in your book, you really do take seriously the drawings that the children create about nature. They're drawing pictures of them hugging the trees. They're drawing pictures of the trees having band-aids and all kinds of art where that is an actual form of care, where the children are seeing themselves caring in these like ultra human ways sometimes. And then you give them space to publicize that type of care. They're like, let's post it on the trees. Let's hang it in every classroom.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like the book doesn't always need to come from someone else. That children can have the space and the time to tell their own stories and generate their own ideas and conversations. Routinely, the children will make birthday books for another child, or even something that they're wrestling with, like emotions of being angry and so forth. So things like literacy is just naturally threaded through our everyday experiences. Even if it's baking, like you said, a recipe or creating a recipe book that's come from families and so forth.
Yeah, and it contributes to the overall culture of care that the Highlanders fostering.
I think it's safe to try again. Here we go.
how do you at Highlander bring in, if you do, current events that might be in people's minds, and the kids that are older especially, you already have their own pad or tablet or maybe even a phone, and then see these popular things that are happening and everyone's talking about them. Do you have a way to filter and bring something in? I'm thinking specifically right now of O.J. Simpson passing, and there's all kinds of stuff. People are just talking about it constantly, and again, the difference between most of the white community and most of the black community being real different about how they're talking about it and what they're saying. So how do you do that? Do you take in? I know you obviously Stop Cop City stuff. That's local, ongoing local events. But what about these? Very very cogent and popular things that happen, specific things that especially kids would find out about, I think, popular people, sports figures or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think there's always choice that has to be made by educators because you can't cover everything. You can't address every subject and so forth. And very often it's the children who bring in the stories. And we're making meaning of what's happening. And I should also preface that a lot of this is with conversation with families. I remember one year, and we have some families who could probably remember this, we were talking about different ways that folks come to this country because very often we honor European immigration and we don't honor non-European. So we were asking all the families, how did you come to this country? And one child, they were of Vietnamese descent, and the grandfather said, we came by way of war. And the child drew a picture of what was happening. And another child said, oh, yeah, because Trump doesn't want people to come into the country at the border. We were like, what? And so children, we recognize they hear information, they gather information, and really being mindful of that. And so it went into a whole conversation about what was happening at the border and ICE. And it was interesting because very often people think we are projecting what children, or we're projecting or sharing information, but very often children are getting bits and pieces of information, and we're trying to help them make meaning of that in a real and serious way. And if you don't ignore it, or if you ignore it, it can actually be quite harmful. In the case of something like O.J. Simpson, we get together and we plan and we make decisions about what we've heard, or we may make a decision about what we want to introduce the children about, and we're curious. We haven't had a conversation about that, and very often that typically is not something that we would discuss in that sense because we wouldn't have discussed him beforehand, if that makes any sense. I mean, the OJ trials is probably like, I don't even know how old I was.
A lot of these kids weren't around.
Right, they weren't around. They would be like, who, orange juice? It wouldn't make sense. So the part of that is making choices with families and in collaboration with each other, what makes most sense for us to pursue, what is closest to their home. So for example, like their playscape, they're very much connected to the trees. We were taking visits to the Wilani Forest. So that is something connected to, who they are and very present. Or we made a decision to hang ribbons in reference to what was happening in Gaza, and to have books and storytelling. So there's a decision making that happens by way of adults. And we just can't address every national thing that happens, if that makes sense.
Hey. So children learn in a lot of different settings, like you just mentioned, that either don't have a pedagogy like the Highlander School, or are imbued with the hegemonic kind of ideals of society that may be in contradiction with the pedagogy of the school. So I'm wondering how you deal with conflicts that emerge in the school that have to do with the things that the children are bringing from that outside space that may be in conflict with the kinds of practices or ways of being that the school is trying to encourage.
Do you have an example or no?
No, not in particular, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Things that
there's a moment in your book where you say that you do move forward with a certain level of assumption of shared values.
Yeah.
And in that context, I think you were talking about like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do move with that assumption, but there are definitely like conflicts about, I remember a group of kids having a conversation about lots of things. We were like, oh, snap, we have to address that. Or only my dad mows the lawns, only dad mows the lawns. Because people are rare and imperfect. And so there's a lots of times when these conversations that are coming authentically from children's observations, they're indoctrinated with a lot of commercialization and TV and so forth. Like one of the things we do ask, for example, families is not to bring in outside toys or different things. So, like in that space, we're really honoring um, children's ability to create something anew as opposed to them just being consumers. I have had moments where I've asked families, they brought in something that was related to an indigenous mascot that I found to be very offensive and didn't align with our values because people don't know on a conscious level how racist. And so, unfortunately, some of my role is also calling people in. So we think of a learning community not for just children, but also for the adults and for ourselves as well. So there's conflicts around that. And when I think of conflicts, again, I don't think of it as necessarily negative and violent, but I think of it as learning opportunities of how we're going to approach um, this. We had, for example, a couple of years ago, our like reflection about our baby dolls and their genitalia and how we can be more expansive around that. So again, another calling in, and I think I've also done a better job of when families come to join us um, talking about shared values and who we are, because we've had families ask us not to let children play with certain things in the past that they associated with a particular gender. And so I was like, this is probably not a good fit. It's for sure not a good fit. Um, but then part of my personality, as I think a lot of parents who are sitting here will tell you, is I'm okay with confrontation from a place of love and calling us into, I don't believe in just putting things or people out, but that we have to lean in, but that in this space and in this community, these are our shared values that we're upholding, that we're not going to forbid a child in engaging in any type of play, that we're not going to forbid children, for example, of dressing any kind of way that they want to. And I hope that maybe addressed a little bit of your question, or if I just got sidetracked and talkative.
Yeah. Um, Along those same lines, and I came in a couple minutes late, so I apologize if you already covered this, but you mentioned brave conversations. And like, I was thinking about how you were talking about like the parent keeping their child from engaging in like somewhat risky play and how like that affects kids as they grow older. And like similarly, I've noticed that as parents, I think we have an impulse to like intervene in moments of conflict and like solve the conflict for our kids. And like, oh no, give that toy back, or like, no, you need to share, or whatever. And I think that you guys at Highlander like engage with kids' conflict differently. And so I'm just curious, like, what you have observed in how kids like resolve their own conflict that maybe like we can learn in terms of like dealing with conflict as adults too.
Yeah, I think that very often today families want to almost kind of like push things away in front of their child. They want to avert all forms of discomfort. Right? They don't want children to experience sadness. Um, and I remember as a parent who's in this room at this moment, and we were talking about something that happened a couple of years ago, and their child said that they were sad. And they said they learned that it's okay to be sad and to sit with something and to wrestle with it. I think we have certain feelings that are good and certain feelings that are bad. And we have almost a culture where it's like it's superficial. Like we all want things to be good. We don't want to hear about something. We don't want to talk about something. And that is where our work comes into. Is that again, the beloved community is love and peace, but it's also the place of tension. In the same way that birth, there is tension, but then there's something anew that is brought forth. And I think there was something I want to say, I almost just lost like complete train of thought, but just, in terms of working out the conflicts, I think it's just in a society that often demands complacency, that has often told you that your voices don't matter. It's understandable why that happens. I also want to hold up something about families, and I want to honor them. Families are working in ways in this culture that are not natural. They are in capitalistic grinds. They do not have paternity leave. They do not have maternity leave. They are working full-time jobs and most often not in community with an aunt or mother, are surrounded by a host of people to help them and support raising their children. So they're in a capitalistic grind. And so when they see their child at 4 or 5 o'clock and they've got an hour before dinner time, yeah, sometimes they don't want the conflict because they can't emotionally deal with it themselves. So also recognizing that the system has in many ways been designed to break us. And that is the context by which a lot of parents are trying to operate, that we're not well. This society is not designed for us to be well. Children were not designed to be dropped off and cared by for someone else after 6 weeks. And so I also want to hold up and honor the ways in which families are trying to survive and love and live in the society. And to bust some of that down means that the beloved community is again sharing of abundance, guaranteed health care, housing, that families have time off to be with their very young children. And I think that's where a lot of the conflicts happen for families, is they just, it's so challenging.
I think that's such an important place to pause, actually, because I think remembering there's so much emphasis on the individual, and I think reminding us that we are part of systems that are failing us is really a part of this. Because how can we support kids without remembering that part, right? And I appreciate you bringing us there and helping us bring our attention to that as we're working with kids, because that's so important. So we want to give time to folks who want to interact with you one-on-one and get their book signed and maybe ask questions they didn't want to ask on a microphone. So I would love if folks are watching online and would like to buy the book, they can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy the book online. Thank you all for being with us tonight virtually. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate when you buy your books from Charis. It really does help us. So